American national parks. Why did it start? It started because a new generation of people were growing up in the United States who did not remember why certain things had been done in the 19th century, like national parks, national forests. So the Forestry Commission originally said, we've got to start telling people why these things are important. They're taking them for granted. And a small profession grew up in presenting these public facilities to a new population which was likely to forget them. Perhaps I should point out that one of the first graphic postage stamps in the United States was of the national parks. A real attempt to promote something to society. And others were very worried that this was going to fade. I define interpretation as adding value to the experience of place. Adding value to the experience of place. In going to the Mackley Hills this morning, it added inestimably to my experience of that place to be surrounded by experts who were telling me not only what things were, but what should happen to them and everything else. Unfortunately, I didn't contribute financially, but financial contribution is another of those added value things. I'm not saying everybody must pay for interpretation, but it certainly requires a sort of touristic relationship, and we can't avoid that. And therefore it becomes something which, when a visitor goes to a site, they want to get value for what they pay. And you might say that's to commercialise. But I can assure you the only way to keep so many of your monuments going and not falling apart is to commercialise to that degree. People are going to have to be charged. Different rates for different people, certainly not local people. But when tourists start coming back, or are guided towards these monuments, they must pay, they expect to. But they expect a good experience, understanding what they're seeing. So there's a new equation to develop. It should be pleasure, it should be learning, but it's also got to be earning, it's got to be financial. And I saw none of that today, so it's all to play for. The history of interpretation in the 60 years it's been going has been initially of literature. In the 1950s, a lot of how things were interpreted was by pamphlets, long texts written by experts, and then signs. But then creeping in by the 1970s was the audio-visual techniques, the sound posts. You walk past a post in a park and it starts talking to you. Bloody nuisance, some people said. Some people said, thank goodness, that's so interesting. And that was the beginning, really, of the electronic revolution when it comes to interpretation. It rather exceeded itself about 2000, and black box experiences were produced. So you didn't show people really authentic objects, you made a sort of television studio thing. In England, one of the first ones was for Robin Hood. Well, as all you know, Robin Hood may have been 2 or 3 different people. He wasn't one person. We don't know who he was. And like probably many folk heroes in Sindh, he's one of those imaginary, semi-mythical people in the past who we refer to. But to establish an exhibition to him and include artifacts, I think was going too far. And eventually, of course, interpretation drew back from that approach, which was largely promoted by video and other producers. A great deal of Japanese money came into interpretation at that time. Avoid any consultant who has in his handbag pictures of video projectors. That's, to my mind, going too far with interpretation. It then focuses on the machinery, not on what's being interpreted. So interpretation still can be a fairly cheap and easy aspect of presentation. It mustn't go into too much media as far as I'm concerned, though many people want you to. I want to move from an introduction to something on recognising diverse audiences and cultures, and this is fairly relevant to talking here. Unless you can control the market very precisely for your site, and certainly the hills today were interesting. Here were some Europeans who had never seen the site before. Here were a number of Pakistani experts who knew the site very well. And here were a number of local pilgrims. And we were all within 100 yards of each other at one time. And in fact, there was some interaction, talking to people. They were all there for good reason, but entirely different reasons. And yet the site served them all. So how on earth do you interpret the site for even that range of people? Well, by separation, by working out what each group would benefit from. And what do we know about the background to interpretation? We know that educational level is a crucial thing. Not necessarily formal education, not necessarily expert education in history. It may be education in building techniques which have been learnt by doing it. But people's involvement in a site or a place is developed through their education. But avoid the idea that the more we educate and the more facts we give people, the more they'll enjoy history. This is not true, and it's proving to be certainly the case in the current generation. Age is inevitably a factor in interpretation. Older people tend to know more because they've been around longer. That's the main reason they know more. It's difficult to avoid knowledge, and they like telling other people. Younger people have learnt much of their knowledge through electronic media, which pressures chronology, doesn't change dates, but change one's understanding of dates. Most of us know that things happen in succession on a date line. This doesn't actually come out of electronic media, and many younger people do not see history as a date line sequence. It's the same as space. There are contractions of space and understandings with regard to how we see space, which we all involve ourselves in. I asked the archivist today, where can this site be seen from? I had some difficulty in getting that idea across to him, but I was basically interested to see how that historic site had been established in the environment so it was visible from a long distance away. Very important facts about the site. It could be shown very easily on a map, of course, or an app on a mobile phone. So good media use is here. I have to say, from even the British point of view, that gender is a major factor in interpretation. Amazingly, men and women see some things very differently and would explain a site or an object very differently. They would look for different elements in it. Not to mutual exclusion, but in Britain we've usually assumed that, oh, well, if men can understand it, women will as well. Well, it's not true. I leave that with you. Women have a very different view of decoration from men and can really complement men's understanding and vice versa. And we've got to recognise that. And level of interest is another factor. So there are a number of audiences which are not simple market segmentations, but if we're designing interpretation for a site, we've got to understand them. And any information that's available at the Hills, for example, assumes a great deal about one's knowledge of a period of Pakistani history and design. And really that is only touching a few people. And to get more people to understand the site, there are a number of techniques which could be used. Who are we explaining the site to? Just imagine the Hills again. Really three very different audiences. You don't need to explain that site to most local people. They will have stories which may be myths, they may be false history, but then what is false history? But they will have explanations for what's around them. We all do, wherever we are. What interpretation could they benefit from? Well, some formal matters, biographies of some of the people who were in the tombs, would enhance their understanding of the site, but it would have to be done very subtly, very carefully, because they've got pretty good knowledge of that place as they use it. For the national community in Pakistan, one imagines that much less is known, so much more is needed. But then there was a group of students there today. If you throw a lot of history at them on a Sunday, I guess they just close up. But it was very good to see you talking to them and making it a human place, which was very interesting. And one has to think in those terms. There's a lot of educational work that could be done, but it mustn't be forced. Remember that they are the customers of monuments in 20 or 30 years' time. If they have a bad experience now, when they're going around with the school, they're going to be much less likely to take their children to monuments, which by that time are going to need more of their money in 20 or 30 years' time. So one has got to encourage their interest. And there are international visitors. Don't say you don't get international visitors, we were there today. And presumably there are many other people who find their way there. It's a World Heritage Site, and I have to underline that, it's a World Heritage Site. Can't really call it a World Heritage Site if there's nobody from outside Pakistan. But it is in the guidebooks. So how do they respond to a site which is speaking in a language which most of them don't know? When I was in a place I've now forgotten. When I was in Bijapur in southern India, there was a marvellous mosque. I'm told it's a mosque with one of the biggest roofs in India. Its date is 1640, 1650. And it's truly an amazing building. You stand there and just amazed by its size and structure. And I thought, this building is within 20 years of St Paul's Cathedral in London. Sir Christopher Wren's cathedral, which he built to replace the former cathedral, the Great Fire. And I look at today, and there is a mosque of great quality, one of the later ones on the sequence, which is the same date. Now, I'm not going to go into sort of strange historical contractions and say A learnt from B, learnt from C, and people wandering across the world, passing plans across. But it is amazing how ideas moved around. And there is a relationship between these very large places of worship with a similar stylistic form. And if one can even show 3 outlines of those buildings and say, look, this is you doing the same thing as people there were doing, people there were doing. These comparisons between countries or continents are so important to start building the idea that it is a world heritage.